Nobody in that restaurant expected the quiet man in worn boots to walk away with a billionaire's heart. They brought him there to laugh at him. What happened next silenced every single one of them. If you've ever been underestimated by people who should have known better, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us your city and country. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now settle in. This one goes deep. The reservation was under the name Carter, Marcus Carter, specifically, because he was the one who'd made it, and he was the one who thought the whole thing was funny. The restaurant was called Ashwood and Pine, which was the kind of name that told you everything you needed to know about the place before you even walked through the door. Heavy wood paneling, dim amber lighting designed to flatter everyone, but especially the sort of people who could afford the menu. White tablecloths so stiff they looked like they'd never been used. A sommelier who floated between tables like he was performing a religious ceremony. Marcus had booked a table for 8. A Thursday evening in late October, the city outside wrapped in cold that hadn't quite committed to being serious yet. He'd told the others to dress appropriately. He hadn't said anything like that to Landon. Landon Pierce arrived 7 minutes late because the sitter, Mrs. Delgado from the building downstairs, had needed him to check her kitchen faucet before he left. And Landon was not the kind of man who said no to Mrs. Delgado. She was 68, her husband had been dead for 4 years, and the faucet had been dripping for a week because she'd been too proud to ask. He'd fixed it in 11 minutes with a wrench from his truck and a washer he kept in the glove compartment. Then he'd gone back upstairs, changed his shirt, kissed Lily on the forehead while she was already half asleep, and driven to Ashwood and Pine. He walked in wearing dark jeans, a button-down that had been ironed but not recently, and boots that were clean but unmistakably work boots, the kind with steel toes and scuff marks that no amount of polish was going to erase. He stood at the entrance for a moment, looking at the room, and a hostess materialized at his elbow with the practiced smile of someone who'd spent years being polite to people who hadn't earned it. "I'm with the Carter party," he said. She led him back. The table was already full except for 2 seats. Marcus was there, and beside him sat Drew Holt, who sold commercial insurance and thought he was funnier than he was. Across from Drew was Kara Simmons, who worked in Vivian Sterling's company in some capacity that changed depending on who was asking. Beside Kara was her husband, Paul. There was a woman named Jess that Landon vaguely knew from a job site 2 years back, and beside Jess was a man Landon didn't recognize at all, who introduced himself as Brett something. The other empty seat was next to Landon's, which had been arranged deliberately. "There he is," Marcus said, too loud, spreading his arms like Landon was the guest of honor at a surprise party. Landon Pierce, finally deciding to rejoin civilization. "I was fixing a faucet," Landon said, sitting down. "Of course you were." Marcus grinned at the others with an expression that said, "See, I told you." Landon picked up the menu. The prices were on the right side of the page without apology. He looked at them for exactly as long as it took to understand the situation he was in, then set the menu down and reached for the water glass. "So," said Kara, leaning forward with a brightness that seemed effortful, "Marcus tells us you're in construction." "Project supervision," Landon said. "Right now I'm on the Meridian Overpass extension downtown." "Oh, that massive thing they've been building for like 3 years?" Jess asked. 2.5. We had foundation issues on the north approach. Set us back 8 months. "Foundation issues," Drew repeated, nodding slowly like this was meaningful to him. Nobody asked a follow-up question. Landon was used to that. The conversation moved on. Marcus ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than Landon's grocery budget for the month, and poured it around the table with the enthusiasm of someone spending money that was easy to spend. Landon accepted a glass and didn't comment on it. 20 minutes in, the door opened, and the temperature in the room seemed to change. It wasn't a dramatic entrance. Vivian Sterling didn't need dramatic entrances. She was the kind of person whose arrival changed the air without her trying. She was 30 years old, though she looked ageless in the way that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with certainty. Dark coat over an understated dress, dark hair swept back, the kind of posture that came from spending years in rooms full of people who wanted things from her. She moved through the restaurant the way water moves, finding the path of least resistance without losing direction. Landon noticed her the way he noticed most things, practically. He registered that she was arriving, that she was attractive, and that Marcus had gotten to his feet with a smile that was suddenly 2 sizes too big. "Vivian, you made it," Marcus said. "Perfect timing." "I'm 12 minutes late," she said. Not an apology, an acknowledgement. "Nobody's counting." Marcus gestured around the table, making introductions. Brett and Paul and Jess and Kara and Drew. Then, "And this is Landon Pierce. Landon, Vivian Sterling." Vivian sat down beside Landon. She accepted the menu from the hostess, looked at it briefly, and set it aside. "Long day?" Landon asked. She looked at him, not sizing him up, just actually looking. 14-hour meeting cycle about a zoning dispute in the financial district. "My lawyers are billing me for the privilege of arguing with each other." "Sounds expensive." "Spectacularly." She reached for the water glass. "What about you?" "Held a site meeting at 6 this morning about rebar placement. Not as expensive. Probably more useful." She almost smiled. "Probably." What happened next was gradual and ugly, in the way that cruelty among adults is always gradual and ugly, built from small moments, accumulating into something designed to leave marks. It started with Drew. "So Landon," Drew said, cutting into his appetizer with the satisfaction of a man who'd been waiting, "Marcus tells us you're a supervisor. What does that pay these days, if you don't mind me asking?" Landon minded. He didn't say so. "Enough." Right, it's just..." Drew gestured vaguely at the menu. "I hope tonight's not breaking the bank." "I'll manage." "Because Marcus mentioned you're doing this solo. Raising a daughter? That can't be cheap. Respect, man, seriously. Single dad, blue collar, making it work." The way Drew said it made it sound like a participation trophy. "Her name's Lily," Landon said. "She's 6. "Cute. Does she ever ask about..." Drew started. "No." The word was flat and final, and Drew had enough self-preservation to recognize a wall when he ran into one. The wine went around again. Kara asked Vivian something about the new Sterling Properties development in the Westgate district, and the conversation shifted, and for a while Landon was allowed to eat in relative peace. He had the salmon. It was good. He ate it without making a production of it, but they circled back. It was Marcus this time, 2 glasses of wine deeper, and therefore more confident. "You know what I always say about Landon? The man is the most talented underachiever I've ever met, genuinely. Like this guy, I've seen him solve problems on a job site in 20 minutes that would take an engineer 2 weeks, and he's been doing the same job for 6 years. "It's a good job," Landon said. "It's a job you could do in your sleep." Marcus turned to Vivian like he was presenting evidence. "He's got an engineering mind, but no engineering degree. Never finished his last year, and now he's got the little girl in the situation, and..." Marcus shrugged, the way someone shrugs when they're pretending to care. "Life gets in the way, right?" "His wife," Jess said quietly, and then seemed to wish she hadn't. The table went briefly still. "She died," Landon said. "Not for sympathy, just to put the fact in the room so it couldn't be whispered about. 4 years ago, Lily was 2. "I'm sorry," Vivian said. She didn't add anything to it, just said the thing and let it be true. "Thank you," Landon said. Marcus, who had the instincts of someone who thought uncomfortable silence was a problem to be solved rather than a feeling to be respected, plowed forward. The point is, Landon here is what you'd call a hidden gem. Right, buddy? Like a diamond in the..." "Don't," Landon said pleasantly. "What?" "Finish that sentence however you want. I'm asking you not to." Marcus laughed, because he thought it was a joke. Vivian didn't laugh. She set her fork down and looked at Marcus with an expression that was almost nothing, just the slightest downward adjustment around her eyes, and Marcus's laugh ran out of air. The dinner continued. The cruelty got more refined as the wine kept coming. It wasn't loud. It was the kind of mean that sophisticated people prefer. Delivered through observation, through comparison, through the careful architecture of a conversation designed to make one person feel small while everyone pretended they were just talking. Drew wondered aloud whether Sterling Properties ever did any workforce housing, for people in trades and whatnot. Kara mentioned that her office was looking for a facilities coordinator if anyone knew someone who needed a simpler role. Brett, who'd been quiet all evening, said something about how it was admirable when people were content with modest lives. Said it looking directly at Landon. Landon ate his dinner. He asked the waiter about the dessert menu and ordered the tart, which was smaller than it looked in the description. He kept his voice even. He didn't explain himself, and he didn't defend himself, and he didn't perform dignity for anyone's benefit. But Vivian was watching. She'd spent the first 40 minutes observing the table the way she observed any room, cataloging, weighing, assigning value. She'd noticed immediately that the evening had been arranged, not for her benefit, as entertainment. She'd attended because Kara had framed it as a casual group dinner with interesting people, and Vivian's calendar had a rare Thursday gap, and she was 30 years old and tired enough of business dinners to accept something that sounded different. She'd noticed the boots immediately. She noticed most things immediately. What she hadn't expected was the rest of it. He hadn't tried to impress her. That alone was unusual enough to register. Every man she'd ever been introduced to had done some version of the same thing: name-dropping, credential presenting, the subtle performance of a person who wanted to be seen as valuable. Landon Pierce had told her about rebar placement. He'd asked about her day like he was actually curious. When the waiter got his order wrong and brought the wrong fish, Landon had quietly corrected it without making the waiter feel incompetent, which was something Vivian had seen adults fail to do in boardrooms. She watched how he sat when the conversation moved away from him. Not tense, not performing relaxation, just present. She watched how he answered questions about Lily, not performing devoted fatherhood for the table, not showing her off as evidence of his goodness, just matter-of-fact and warm. She watched how he absorbed Drew's comments and Marcus's commentary, and Brett studied condescension without letting any of it touch the center of him. Then came the moment. It was Marcus again, glass number 3, voice carrying across the table. I'm just saying, and I say this with love, that some people have the talent and just don't have the drive to do something with it. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a valid life choice. The table had gone a particular kind of quiet that happens when someone has said the thing everyone else was thinking but had the sense not to say out loud. Landon was quiet for a moment. He set his fork down with the careful patience of someone who was deciding something. Then he picked up his napkin, set it on the table, and pushed his chair back. "Thank you for dinner," he said. To the table, not to Marcus specifically. His voice was level. "It was good to see most of you." He paused. "Not all of you," he said, "but most of you." He looked at Vivian briefly, not asking for anything, not performing a dignified exit for her benefit. Just a look that acknowledged she'd been there in this strange evening, and that he'd registered her presence as something separate from the rest of it. Then he walked out. No scene, no argument, no raised voice. He left $40 on the table as his share of what they'd ordered and walked through Ashwood and Pine toward the exit with the unhurried certainty of a man who'd decided he was done and saw no reason to rush. The table sat in silence for 3 full seconds. Marcus said, "Well," and reached for the wine bottle. Vivian set her own napkin on the table. She was running a calculation, the kind she ran when a project variable changed unexpectedly, and she needed to reassess her position. She'd spent dinner watching a man absorb sustained humiliation and emerge from it with his dignity entirely intact, not because he'd defended it, but because he'd simply never surrendered it. She'd watched him fix the situation with the fish. She'd watched him say her name's Lily, like a small correction to the universe. She thought about the way he'd looked at the menu when he sat down, that brief, pragmatic assessment of the prices, and then the deliberate setting aside of it, the decision to be present in the evening regardless. She thought about him arriving late because he'd been fixing someone's faucet. She thought about him saying enough when Drew asked about money, and how that single word had been more dignified than any number Drew could have named. "Who is he?" she asked. Not to Marcus, to Kara, who actually knew things. He's just a project supervisor, Landon Pierce. He's worked a few Sterling sites, actually. Meridian Overpass, I think. Maybe one of the Hargrove builds a couple years back. Vivian processed this. "Is he good?" she asked. Kara blinked. "At construction?" "At his job." Honestly, I don't know. I think he's competent. I can check." "Please do," Vivian said. She picked up her wine glass, took a single unhurried sip, and set it down with the precision of someone who had already moved on to the next problem. Outside, 3 blocks away, Landon Pierce was sitting in his truck in the cold, the engine running, the heater just beginning to take hold. He was looking at his phone, a text from Mrs. Delgado saying, "Lily is sleeping beautifully. Faucet is perfect. Thank you. with 3 separate heart emojis. He smiled at that. Not a performed smile. Just the real one. The small private kind. The kind that had nothing to do with the restaurant or the people in it. He put the truck in drive and headed home. He didn't know that behind him, through the amber-lit window of Ashwood and Pine, a woman with more resources than most small countries was making a quiet decision that would rewrite the next several years of both their lives. He didn't know, and it wouldn't have changed how he drove home. Carefully, both hands on the wheel, already thinking about whether Lily had eaten enough at dinner, and whether her cold from last week had fully cleared, and whether he'd remembered to sign her permission slip for the school field trip on Friday. That was the thing about Landon Pierce. His mind was always on the next right thing. He'd never learned to think about the people watching him, which was exactly, as it turned out, why Vivian Sterling couldn't stop watching. Kara Simmons sent the file at 11:47 that night, which meant she'd pulled it together fast, faster than Vivian had expected, which meant Kara was either more efficient than she'd given her credit for or more nervous about the request than she was letting on. Probably both. Vivian was sitting at her kitchen island in her apartment on the 31st floor, still in the clothes she'd worn to dinner, a cup of tea cooling beside her laptop. The apartment was large and well-designed and had cost more than most people made in 15 years, and at this hour it felt exactly as large as it was. She'd lived alone for so long that the silence had stopped feeling like anything at all. She opened the file. Landon Pierce, 32, site supervisor, currently assigned to the Meridian Overpass Extension, city contract number 7-144. Before that, Hargrove Commercial Build on the east side, 18 months. Before that, 2 years on the Callaway Infrastructure Project, which had come in 4% under budget and 6 weeks ahead of schedule. Before that, 3 more projects, going back 8 years, each one with performance notes that read like someone was trying very hard not to promote him. Reliable. Thorough. Respected by crew. Problem-solving above pay grade. That last phrase appeared in 3 separate evaluations, written by 3 different supervisors who'd never met each other, which meant it wasn't a copied observation. It was a pattern. She read it again. Problem-solving above pay grade. Not a compliment, she thought, a confession. Every supervisor who'd written that phrase had benefited from Landon Pierce's capabilities while paying him for something considerably smaller. She scrolled further. Education, 2.5 years of civil engineering at Dayton State before he'd withdrawn. No explanation given. She knew enough to guess. The timeline matched Lily's birth by about 7 months. And before that there was a marriage record, and before that, nothing that the HR file could tell her. Just a gap where a young man had been building one life and then found himself building a completely different one instead. There were no complaints on record, no disciplinary actions, no formal recognition either, which was its own kind of information. Companies filed paperwork when they wanted to protect themselves or reward someone. The absence of either was a portrait in itself. Vivian closed the laptop and sat for a while looking at the middle distance. She was not someone who made decisions impulsively. Every significant move she'd made in the last decade, acquiring the Westgate parcels before the zoning change, pulling out of the Harmon development, 18 months before it collapsed, restructuring the company's debt when interest rates were still favorable, had been preceded by a period of quiet analysis that people around her sometimes mistook for hesitation. It wasn't hesitation. It was the difference between acting and reacting, and she'd learned the difference early enough that it had become instinct. What she was feeling now, sitting in her quiet apartment at midnight with a cold cup of tea and a personnel file on her screen, was not impulsive. It had the quality of a calculation she'd already half completed without realizing she'd started it. She picked up her phone and sent Kara a follow-up message. "Which Sterling site is he on tomorrow?" "Tomorrow?" Kara replied 3 minutes later, which suggested she was still awake and had anticipated the question. "Meridian Overpass." But also, "The Glenfield Sustainable Project Review is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. He's on the invited list as a site rep. Might be worth attending." Vivian looked at the message. The Glenfield Review had been on her calendar for 2 weeks. She'd been planning to send her deputy director, a capable man named Harris, who was thorough and reliable and entirely uninteresting to talk to. She typed back, "I'll take it myself." Then she put her phone down, finished this cold tea without complaint, and went to bed. She didn't sleep particularly well, which she would not have admitted to anyone. But The Glenfield Review was held in a converted warehouse space near the waterfront that Sterling Properties had been using as a temporary project office since the spring. 14 people around a long folding table, laptops and rolled blueprints and coffee cups from 3 different places because nobody had thought to organize a single order. The kind of meeting that happened when a project was in trouble, but nobody wanted to be the first person to say so out loud. Vivian arrived 8 minutes early, which was unusual enough that Harris visibly adjusted his posture when she walked in. She sat at the far end of the table, opened her portfolio, and said nothing. People arranged themselves. Someone tried to offer her better coffee from a thermos, and she accepted without comment. Landon arrived with 2 other men from the Meridian site, a structural engineer named Cook, who had the permanent expression of someone who'd been arguing with city inspectors for too long, and a younger guy whose name Vivian didn't catch and didn't ask. Landon sat on the left side of the table, middle of the row, and he didn't notice her for the first 4 minutes, which she found she didn't mind. When he did notice, there was a moment, brief enough that most people would have missed it, where something shifted in his expression. Not alarm, not the performed surprise of someone encountering a pleasant coincidence. Something quieter than that. Recalibration. Then he looked back at the blueprints in front of him and didn't look up again for several minutes. The meeting started with a presentation from the project architect, a woman named Ferris, who was clearly tired and trying not to show it. The Glenfield Sustainable Housing Project was a $90 million development. Sterling's most ambitious community initiative, 48 units of affordable family housing built to environmental standards that were, as the company's press materials had carefully noted, significantly above what any local ordinance required. It was the project Vivian was most personally invested in, which was why it was also the project that was currently 17 weeks behind schedule and had burned through its first contingency budget. The problem, Ferris explained, was the site's soil composition. The geotechnical surveys from 8 months ago had underestimated the variance in the eastern foundation zone. 3 separate engineering firms had proposed solutions. All 3 were expensive, 2 were time-consuming, and the third had a materials dependency that would tie them to a single supplier with a history of delivery delays. The room had the particular energy of a group of professionals who'd been going in circles long enough that they'd stopped looking for exits and started arguing about the furniture. Harris presented his summary. Then the lead contractor presented his numbers. Then Ferris presented a revised timeline that made Harris wince visibly. Then someone from the finance side said something about carrying costs that made the contractor wince. Vivian listened to all of it. Then she said, "Mr. Pierce?" The room turned. Landon looked up from the blueprints he'd been studying. Actually studying, she noticed, not skimming. He'd had them for maybe 20 minutes, and he'd been going through them with the systematic attention of someone who was looking for a specific thing. "You've been quiet," she said. "I've been reading," he said. "What do you think?" Cook, beside him, shifted in his seat. The contractor looked at Landon with the expression of a man watching someone else be handed a grenade. Landon looked at Vivian for a moment, assessing whether she was asking a genuine question or a performative one, and apparently decided it was genuine. "The East Zone problem is real," he said, "but the framing is wrong. Every proposal I've seen is treating it as a foundation replacement issue. It's not. It's a load distribution issue, which is a different problem with a different solution set." He glanced at Ferris. "Can I?" Ferris gestured at the blueprints with something that was almost relief. "Please." Landon stood up and moved to the center of the table. He wasn't performing. There was nothing about his body language that suggested he was enjoying the moment or was aware of being watched. He moved like someone who had a point to make and was making it as directly as possible. The East Zone has variable soil density, which the original survey caught but underweighted. The 3 proposals all assume you need to go deeper on the foundation, which is expensive, slow, and creates the supply chain problem you've got with option 3. But if you look at the load paths, he laid his hand on a specific section of the structural blueprint. There's a redistribution option. You shift the primary load-bearing elements here and here, introduce a transfer structure across this span, and the East Zone soil variance becomes manageable without full remediation. You're adding maybe 300,000 in structural steel, but you're cutting 6 to 8 weeks off the timeline and eliminating the supplier dependency entirely. Silence. Not the silence of people being polite. The silence of people doing math. Cook leaned forward and looked at the blueprint. His eyes moved. "That works," he said, with the slightly aggravated tone of someone who'd just realized they should have thought of it themselves. "You'd need to recalculate the live load assumptions for the residential floors," Landon said, sitting back down, "and run it past the structural engineer of record. But the geometry works. I checked it twice." Harris looked at Vivian. Vivian was looking at Landon. "What else?" she asked. Landon glanced at her with a flicker of something. Not quite wariness, not quite surprise. "You want more?" "I want whatever you were going to say and then stopped yourself from saying." A pause. "The window procurement schedule," he said. "Your lead time projections assume current shipping timelines, but the manufacturer you've specified has had a labor dispute at their fabrication facility in Georgia for about 6 weeks. It hasn't hit the trade's news yet, but it'll affect deliveries. You should be looking at an alternate specification for the upper floor units at minimum." Now Ferris was looking at him. "How do you know about the Georgia facility?" "I know someone who sources windows for a contractor down there. He called me last week about something else and mentioned it." "That's," Ferris started, then stopped. "It's useful," Vivian said. The meeting ran another 90 minutes. Landon spoke 3 more times, not to dominate the conversation, but when someone said something that was technically incorrect, and when someone proposed a solution that created a downstream problem nobody else had caught. Each time he spoke the same way, briefly, specifically, without looking around to see whether he was impressing anyone. After the meeting, people filtered out in groups. Vivian stayed at the table making notes. She was aware, without looking up, that Landon had stayed to help Cook roll the blueprints, the two of them doing it efficiently, the way men who work with their hands manage physical tasks, without ceremony. When Cook left, Landon was the only other person in the room. Vivian looked up. "You didn't have to come yourself," he said. Not confrontationally, just noting the fact. "I'm aware." Harris could have run that meeting. Harris would have accepted all 3 original proposals and asked the finance team to pick the least bad one. Landon considered this. "Fair." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. Outside, through the warehouse's high industrial windows, the waterfront light was flat and gray. Mid-afternoon in November, the sky the color of concrete that couldn't decide whether to rain. "What happened Thursday night?" Vivian said. "The dinner. I want you to know I didn't know it was arranged that way." Landon looked at her. "You figured it out eventually." "Within the first 15 minutes. I figured it out within the first 5, he said, not bitterly. "It's fine. Marcus means well. He just has a limited definition of entertainment. He's not your friend." "No," Landon agreed with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who'd already made that calculation years ago. "He's someone I've known a long time. It's not the same thing." Vivian looked at him. There it was again. That quality she'd noticed at the restaurant, the refusal to perform. Most people, when you handed them an opportunity to be self-pitying or aggrieved, took it. It was a natural human thing to do. Landon Pierce set it down like he'd been offered something he didn't have a use for. "The load redistribution solution," she said. "Have you designed something like that before?" "Similar principle. Different application. There was a bridge approach in Columbus about 4 years ago. Different soil issue. Same basic logic." "Did you document it?" He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "The firm I was working for at the time documented it under the lead engineer's name." She let that sit for a moment. "And the engineer of record was not you." "I didn't have the license." He said it without resentment, which made it worse somehow. "I was 3 credits short of the degree when I left school. Never went back. So no, I couldn't be the engineer of record on anything. I've been the person who does the work and hands it to whoever has the credentials." "For how long?" 8 years. Vivian set her pen down. She was looking at him with the focused attention she gave to things that required genuine understanding, and she was aware that the attention made him slightly uncomfortable, and she didn't pull it back. "Do you intend to finish the degree?" she said. "I've thought about it. It's complicated with Lily's schedule, and the cost." He stopped. "It's not impossible. I just haven't made it the priority." "What is the priority?" "She is," he said. "Just that. No elaboration." Vivian nodded slowly. It was the answer she'd expected, which didn't make it any less clarifying to hear. I'm going to the site tomorrow morning, she said. The Meridian Overpass. I have questions about the North Approach remediation that nobody at this company has been able to answer to my satisfaction. Landon put on his jacket. That's your right. It's a Sterling subcontract. I know it's my right. She picked up her portfolio. I'm telling you because you'll be there, and I'd rather you not be surprised. He looked at her again with that measuring quality, and she had the distinct sense that he was deciding something. Not about her, about the situation. 6:30 site meeting, he said. Main trailer. I'll be there at 6:15. Something crossed his face that was close to amusement, though it didn't quite arrive. Okay, he said. He left. She heard his footsteps on the concrete floor and then the heavy door of the warehouse, and then nothing. She sat alone in the empty project office for a moment, which she almost never did. Sat in rooms and let time pass without filling it. Outside, a gull crossed the window. The gray light pressed against the glass. She thought about 8 years. 8 years of handing your best ideas to other people and watching them receive credit for it. 8 years of being the solution that nobody acknowledged. Most people, subjected to that long enough, developed one of two responses. They got angry or they shrank. Landon Pierce seemed to have done neither, which was either a sign of unusual psychological health or a sign that he'd buried the anger somewhere very deep and very quiet. She suspected it was more complicated than either. Most things were. I was on the North Approach when she arrived the next morning at 6:14, standing on a temporary platform above the foundation work with a hard hat and a flashlight, looking at something in the structural cavity that clearly wasn't what it was supposed to be. 2 of his crew were with him, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s named Ruiz, who seemed to function as Landon's second-in-command, and a younger worker who was writing things in a notebook with the focused energy of someone taking an exam. Vivian climbed the platform stairs. Nobody stopped her. She was wearing a hard hat she'd brought from her own site kit. Matte black, Sterling Properties logo removed with a piece of electrical tape, which was a small habit she'd developed after noticing that people on job sites talked more freely when they couldn't tell at a glance who had the most expensive zip code. Landon glanced over when she reached the platform. You're early. You said 6:15. I said you'd be here at 6:15. I've been here since 5. She looked into the foundation cavity. There were rebar configurations that struck her immediately as wrong, though she would have struggled to articulate exactly why. What am I looking at? The North Approach Foundation, Section 7, Landon said. The remediation work we did 6 weeks ago to correct the original settling issue. He aimed the flashlight at a specific junction. You see where those ties are placed? She leaned in. They're too far apart. He looked at her with a brief recalibration, the way he'd looked at her in the Glenfield meeting. Yeah. Whoever did the remediation work followed the repair spec correctly, but the spec itself had an error. The tie spacing was calculated for the original soil load. It didn't account for the added lateral pressure from the drainage rerouting on the west bank. He moved the flashlight. It's not a crisis. Yet. But it'll present in about 18 months if we get a wet winter and the soil saturates the way it did 2 years ago. Did you flag this to the project engineer? 3 weeks ago. And I was told that the remediation had been signed off by the engineer of record and the city inspector, and that if I had concerns, I should submit them in writing to the project manager. Did you? I submitted them in writing 10 days ago. He lowered the flashlight. I haven't gotten a response. Vivian straightened up. Around them, the site was beginning to activate. The sound of equipment, of voices, of a workday assembling itself from its components. Ruiz had moved a respectful distance away and was talking into a radio. Who is the project manager on this contract? She asked. Whitfield, Brian Whitfield. He reports to your infrastructure division. She pulled out her phone and made a note. That'll be addressed today. I'm not asking you to fight my battles, Landon said. I'm not fighting your battles. She put her phone away. I own the company that has a defective foundation in a public infrastructure contract. That's a liability issue, not a favor. He was quiet for a moment, then, fair enough. They stood on the platform in the early morning cold, the city spreading out below them in the gray November light, and Vivian asked him questions about the foundation, and he answered them, and she asked follow-up questions that told him she understood the answers, and somewhere in that exchange the quality of the conversation changed in a way that was hard to name precisely. It stopped being an inspection and became something more like a discussion between two people who were paying genuine attention to the same problem. At one point, Ruiz came back to report something about a delivery and addressed Landon without looking at Vivian at all, which meant Ruiz either didn't know who she was or had decided it wasn't relevant information. Landon responded, adjusted a scheduling detail on the spot, sent Ruiz off with an plan, all of it in under 2 minutes. Efficient and calm and without the performance of authority, no raised voice, no demonstrative decision-making, just the natural function of someone who knew what needed doing and had thought about it clearly enough to communicate it directly. She watched this and said nothing. They climbed back down from the platform. At the bottom, Landon pulled off his work gloves and folded them into his back pocket. He had grease on his left forearm from something that had happened before she arrived. "Thank you," she said, "for this morning." "You asked the right questions," he said. "You gave me something worth asking questions about." He looked at her in the morning light, the real morning now, the sun beginning to work its way up behind the building line, putting color into the sky that hadn't been there an hour ago. He looked tired, she thought. Not depleted, just the accumulated tiredness of someone who'd been running on a limited supply of sleep for several years and had made a private decision that it was simply the condition of their life. "Do you do this often?" she asked. "Come in at 5? "When something's bothering me." He looked back at the north approach. "It was bothering me." "The tie spacing." "Yeah." He paused. "And other things." She didn't ask what other things. Not because she wasn't curious, because she recognized the quality of the pause and understood that some things were not being offered, they were being held, and you didn't reach for things people were holding. Not if you had any sense. She picked up her hard hat. "I'll follow up on Whitfield." "I know you will," he said. Not sarcastically, with the particular quality of someone who had learned to recognize when a person meant what they said and was registering it as notable. She walked back toward the site entrance. At the gate she paused, without quite knowing why, and looked back. He was already moving again, toward a cluster of workers who were waiting for him near the equipment shed, already reaching for his gloves, already thinking about whatever the next thing was. He didn't look back. That was the thing about him that she kept returning to, that night in her apartment when she was supposed to be reviewing the Westgate zoning documents and couldn't concentrate. Everyone she'd ever known who had significant ability had also had significant awareness of being observed. It was almost a law. Talent and self-consciousness traveled together, because the talented person knew they were being evaluated, and that knowledge lived in the body, in the way they moved through rooms and conversations. Landon Pierce moved through everything like nobody was watching, not because he was oblivious, because he'd decided at some point that it didn't matter. She didn't know when she'd started finding that particular quality so difficult to look away from. She admitted to herself somewhere around 11 that night, in the particular early stage of something she hadn't planned for and wasn't entirely sure how to manage. It was not a comfortable position. She was accustomed to knowing what she wanted and understanding how to obtain it. She was accustomed to environments where her authority was legible and her intelligence was the primary operating variable. Landon Pierce was not an environment she could control, and she had the distinct sense that trying would be exactly the wrong approach. She sent Whitfield a formal written notice about the tie spacing issue at 11:23 p.m. She CC'd the city infrastructure office and Sterling's legal team. It was a necessary business action, and also, she acknowledged privately, the only thing she could do for Landon Pierce right now that he would actually accept. She got a response from Whitfield at 7:08 the following morning, which was a full 8 minutes faster than she'd ever received a response from him on anything else. That evening, she went past the Meridian site, which was not on her route home and required a deliberate detour. She did it anyway. She sat in her car across the street for a moment, watching the site wind down for the day. Workers clearing, equipment being secured, the particular organized chaos of a large project transitioning from active to overnight. She scanned for Landon. She found him at the south gate, talking to a worker she didn't recognize, both of them looking at something on a clipboard. She was too far away to hear anything. After a minute, the worker nodded, and Landon handed him the clipboard, and the worker headed back into the site. Then Landon looked at his watch, pulled out his phone, and appeared to read something. She guessed the expression, which was small and involuntary and private, meant a message from Mrs. Delgado, or from Lily's school, something about the 6-year-old who was always the first priority. He put the phone in his pocket and walked toward the parking area. Vivian put her car in drive and pulled away before he could see her. She drove home without music, thinking about the difference between knowing what you want and understanding what it costs, and whether, at 30 years old, with a company to run and a city's worth of obligations pressing on her from every direction, she was prepared to find out. She thought she probably was. The thought made her nervous in a way she hadn't felt in a long time, which she took, cautiously, as a reasonable sign. The coffee truck was called Groundwork, and it parked outside Sycamore Elementary every Tuesday and Thursday between 2:30 and 4 because the owner, a former electrician named Gerald, who'd blown out his back at 51 and pivoted to espresso, had figured out that teachers and parents were a more reliable revenue stream than the downtown lunch crowd. He made a decent Americano and a very good cortado, and he remembered regular customers' orders without being asked, which was the kind of small grace that made ordinary days easier. Vivian had found it on a Tuesday. She'd been driving past the school after a site visit 2 blocks over, the Hargrove residential conversion, a smaller Sterling project she rarely visited personally. And she'd seen the truck and the line of parents and the yellow doors of the elementary school, and she'd sat at the traffic light for 10 seconds longer than necessary. On Thursday, she came back. She told herself it wasn't what it was. She told herself she was in the neighborhood. She told herself she just wanted coffee. She parked half a block away, ordered a cortado from Gerald, who said same as Tuesday, without looking up, and stood beside the truck in the thin November sunlight, and waited and felt more nervous than she had in any of the several hundred business meetings she'd attended in the last decade, which was the kind of information about herself that she received with something between annoyance and reluctant acceptance. She was wearing her work clothes, tailored wool coat, dark trousers, boots that had cost a significant amount of money, and looked it. She was aware of this. She was aware of how she looked standing next to a coffee truck outside an elementary school. She didn't have a plan beyond the basic fact of being there, which was itself unusual for a person who generally did not enter rooms without a clear sense of what she intended to accomplish inside them. The yellow doors opened at 3:15. Children emerged in the way children emerge from schools, not in a flow, but in a burst, kinetic and loud, and entirely without self-consciousness. Parents who'd been standing in loose clusters tightened into arrival positions, eyes scanning. Landon came through the gate at 3:19. He was still in his work clothes, the canvas jacket, the steel-toed boots, a faded thermal under a flannel that she recognized from the site. There was still dust on him. He walked with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes on the school doors. And he had the look of a man who'd been in motion since 5 in the morning and who would be in motion for several more hours yet, and who had arranged his entire existence around this particular moment in the afternoon being non-negotiable. Lily came through the doors 30 seconds later. 6 years old, dark hair and 2 uneven braids that suggested Landon had done them himself and done his sincere best. A backpack that was nearly as large as she was and covered in iron-on patches of various animals. She found her father in the crowd with the immediate, unerring accuracy of children who have learned to locate their person quickly, and she crossed the distance between them at a run. Landon caught her. He didn't make a production of it, just opened his arms at the right moment and absorbed the impact and swung her up slightly and set her back down and said something that made her laugh, and then crouched down to her level to hear whatever she was telling him, which she was telling him urgently and at length. Vivian watched this from beside the coffee truck and felt something move in her chest that she didn't have an immediate word for. It wasn't sentiment exactly, though it had sentiment in it. It was more like recognition of something genuine in a world that had a great deal of performance in it, and the recognition was uncomfortable because it reached past her professional caution and touched something she kept more carefully guarded. She nearly left. The specific impulse to get back in her car and drive away was real and lasted about 4 seconds. Then Landon stood up and turned and saw her. The expression on his face was not what she'd expected. She'd expected surprise, possibly the guarded kind, the kind that asked what this was. What she got instead was a stillness, like a man who had encountered something unexpected and was deciding whether it was a problem or not. Lily tugged his jacket. He looked down at her and said something. She looked over at Vivian with the frank and comprehensive curiosity that 6-year-olds apply to everything, and then she started walking toward the coffee truck with her father, because the coffee truck had a small basket of lollipops on the counter that Lily had apparently already identified as the most important feature of the immediate environment. They ended up standing 3 feet apart. Vivian held out one of the cups. Gerald made an extra, she said, which was not true, but was the version of events she'd decided on. Landon looked at the cup. He looked at her. You're outside my daughter's school. I'm aware of that. With coffee. I'm aware of that too. A pause. He took the cup. Not because he was comfortable with the situation. She could see that he wasn't, not entirely, but because refusing it would have made the moment more complicated than accepting it. And Landon Pierce, she was learning, had a pragmatic relationship with unnecessary complication. He didn't seek it. Lily had acquired a lollipop, grape, from the color. She stood beside her father and looked at Vivian with the direct, unselfconscious assessment of a child who hasn't yet learned that staring is considered rude. I'm Lily, she said. I know, Vivian said. I'm Vivian. That's a fancy name. I've been told. My teacher's name is Mrs. Okafor, and she has a really fancy name too, but she lets us call her Mrs. O. Lily considered this information she'd offered and then pivoted without transition, as 6-year-olds do. Do you know my dad? Yes. From work? From work, yes. Lily nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned her attention to the lollipop. Landon was watching Vivian with an expression she still couldn't entirely read. Not unfriendly, but not open either. Careful. The look of someone who'd been in situations that seemed simple and revealed themselves not to be, and who had gotten cautious as a result. I wanted to talk to you, Vivian said. Not about the site, not about Glenfield, about something else. Something else, he repeated. I haven't stopped thinking about the dinner, she said. I've been trying to talk myself out of saying that because it sounds... I'm aware of how it sounds. But I've been thinking about it since Thursday night, and I've tried to be rational about it, and I'm here anyway. He looked at her for a long moment. The coffee truck behind them had a small radio playing something from the 80s. Parents and children moved past in the ordinary traffic of a school afternoon. Gerald called out an order. What does Rational say? Landon asked. Rational says you're a site supervisor on 2 of my company's contracts, which makes this professionally complicated. Rational says I showed up at your workplace twice this week, which is, she paused, a little much. Rational says you're raising a 6-year-old by yourself, and I have a company with 800 employees and we are operating in very different circumstances. And yet, he said, and yet, Lily had finished the lollipop at an impressive speed and was now examining the stick with the focus of a scientist. Landon glanced at her, then back at Vivian. What are you asking? He said. Vivian had prepared for this question. She'd thought about how to say it in the car, driving over, and she'd discarded several versions that sounded like business proposals. She didn't have a polished version left. What she had was the plain one. I'm asking if you'd have dinner with me, she said. Not like the other dinner, no audience, no agenda. Just dinner, with me, as a person. The request sat between them in the November air. Landon looked at his coffee cup. He looked at Lily, who had migrated toward the truck to investigate whether there were additional lollipop flavors. He looked back at Vivian. I need to be honest with you about something, he said. Please. Lily is not an afterthought. He said it without aggression, but without softness either, like a foundation, laid first before anything else could be built. I've tried dating before, twice in the last 4 years. Both times the woman said she understood that, and both times it turned out she was being polite rather than accurate. And I don't blame them. I understand that a ready-made kid isn't what most people are looking for, but I can't do another version of that. Vivian nodded. That's fair. I'm not finished, he said. She waited. I don't have a lot of extra time. I'm at the site by 5 most mornings. I pick Lily up every day unless there's an emergency, and I define emergency narrowly. She has school events and medical appointments and bad nights sometimes. And she asks questions about everything, including people I bring around, and I don't bring people around unless I think it's worth answering those questions honestly. Vivian looked at Lily, who had successfully negotiated a strawberry lollipop from Gerald and was now returning toward them with the satisfaction of a skilled diplomat. She already asked me your name, Vivian said. She asks everyone's name. She told me her teacher is called Mrs. O. Something shifted in his face. Small, but real. Mrs. Okafor. She talks about her constantly. She seems comfortable talking to people she doesn't know. She gets that from her mother, he said, flat, factual. No performance of grief around it. Just the truth of who Lily had come from, stated simply because it was simply true. Lily arrived back beside them and inserted herself into the space between her father and Vivian with the total unconscious confidence of a child who doesn't yet understand that some spaces between adults are meant to remain. "Dad," she said, "Gerald says he has hot chocolate on Thursdays, but only if you order it before 3:30. Can I have hot chocolate?" "You just had a lollipop." "Hot chocolate is different than a lollipop." "Is it?" "Yes, because one is a drink and one is candy, so they're in completely different categories." Landon looked at Vivian with an expression that had resigned amusement in it. "She does this. The categorical argument, the categorical argument, the procedural argument, the historical precedent argument. She's been doing them since she was 4. "Dad," Lily said, patiently. "Yes," he said. "You can have hot chocolate." Lily went back to Gerald. Landon watched her go with the particular quality of attention that parents of children who've experienced loss develop. Not anxious, not hovering, just present. A long thread of awareness, quietly maintained. He turned back to Vivian. "She likes you," he said. "She's been talking to me for 4 minutes." "She's 6. 4 minutes is plenty." He looked at Vivian with the careful directness she'd come to associate with him. "She's a decent judge of people. Better than me, probably." "That would make you a bad judge of people." "I'm not a bad judge. I'm just slower." He paused. "I trusted the wrong people for a long time. It took me a while to understand that some people's friendliness is actually about what you can do for them, not who you are. Marcus was a long education in that particular lesson." "And where do I land?" Vivian asked. She asked it plainly, because she was done being anything other than plain about this. He looked at her for a moment. "I don't know yet. That's honest. I'm trying to be." "So am I," she said. Lily came back with the hot chocolate in both hands, moving with the extreme deliberate care of a child transporting something that might spill, tongue slightly out in concentration. She made it without incident and stood beside her father and drank it, and looked at the street. "Vivian," she said without preamble. "Yes?" "Do you like dinosaurs?" Vivian glanced at Landon, who offered nothing. "I don't know a great deal about them," she said, "but I'm willing to learn." Lily considered this as a serious response, which it was. "I have a book," she said. "It's about the Cretaceous period, which is the one with the T-Rex. But the T-Rex isn't actually the most interesting dinosaur. The most interesting one is the Therizinosaurus, because it had claws that were literally 3 feet long, but it only ate plants." "That is interesting," Vivian said. "I know." Lily drank her hot chocolate. "You can borrow the book if you want." Landon made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but close. He covered it by looking at his phone, which he then actually looked at for a real reason, some site notification that made a brief tension cross his face before he filed it away. "I need to get her home," he said. "She has reading homework and I have calls tonight." He looked at Vivian. "Saturday." She went still. "Saturday. There's a place near my apartment called Bellamy's. It's not Ashwood and Pine. It's a diner, essentially. Good food, loud sometimes, nothing impressive." He said the last part like a mild challenge, like he was presenting terms and she could take them or not. "Saturday," she said. "What time?" 6:30, if that works." "It works." He nodded. He took Lily's free hand. She gave it without looking, purely from habit, the automatic trust of a child who has always found her parents' hand there. And they started walking toward the parking area. Vivian stood beside the coffee truck and watched them go. Lily was talking again, something about the Therizinosaurus probably, and Landon was listening with the particular lean of a tall person making himself accessible to a small one, his head angled slightly toward her. Gerald appeared at the counter and looked at Vivian. "Another cortado?" "No," she said. "Thank you." She walked back to her car. She sat in it for a moment without starting the engine. The school behind her was quiet now. The afternoon crowd dispersed, the yellow doors closed. She thought about what she'd said. No agenda, no expectations. And whether that was entirely true, and decided that it was and it wasn't, the way most honest things are true and also partial. She didn't have an agenda. She had something less organized and more disorienting than that. She had the specific feeling of encountering something real after a long time of encountering things that were polished and strategic and carefully managed, and the feeling was good and also frightening in the low-grade constant way of anything that actually matters. She started the car and pulled into traffic. Saturday came with the particular quality of November Saturdays, cold with intention now, the kind of cold that didn't need wind to make itself known, just the flat gray weight of a sky that had committed. Vivian spent the day working, which she did most Saturdays, though she caught herself checking the time twice in the afternoon in a way she hadn't done before a professional meeting in years. She changed clothes 3 times. She would not have admitted this to anyone. She settled on dark jeans and a wool sweater and a coat that was warm without being conspicuous. And she looked at herself in the mirror with the brisk assessment of a person who has decided something and is executing on the decision and is not going to overthink the execution. Bellamy's was on Croft Street, between a dry cleaner and a hardware store, the kind of block that hadn't been discovered yet by the wave of expensive renovation moving through the neighborhood. It had been there since 1987, according to the small plaque beside the door, which meant it had survived 4 different economic cycles and 2 neighborhood identity crises and whatever else a city could throw at a diner over 38 years. Inside, vinyl booths in a faded burgundy, pendant lights that were warm rather than flattering, laminated menus with photographs of the food, which Vivian found unexpectedly charming. The smell was coffee and something with butter. Landon was already there. Booth near the back to the wall. She noticed that automatically, the choice that people make when they want to see the room. He was wearing a dark Henley and jeans, and he'd made an effort. She could see it, the careful effort of someone who doesn't have much practice with the ritual and is doing it seriously rather than stylishly. He stood when she approached, which she hadn't expected. "You didn't have to do that," she said, sliding into the booth. "My mother would disagree." "Where is she?" "Ohio. She calls on Sundays and tells me I'm raising Lily correctly and working too hard. In that order." He sat. "My dad's there too. They've been married 41 years. He worked in tool and die manufacturing his whole career. She taught 3rd grade. That explains some things about you." "What things?" She looked at him. "You know how to talk to people without making them feel small. That doesn't come from nowhere." He seemed to consider this with more seriousness than she'd expected. "My mother never had a student she didn't like. Or if she did, she didn't say so. She'd find the thing about each kid, whatever it was, the thing they could do or the thing they were interested in, and she'd organize the whole year around pulling that thing out." He turned his water glass slowly on the table. "I've thought about that a lot. How she could see what was in people before they'd done anything to prove it." The waitress came. Her name tag said Denise, and she'd been working there long enough that she brought the coffee without being asked, setting cups down and filling them with the economy of motion that comes from doing something 10,000 times. Landon ordered the meatloaf. He said it without embarrassment, which Vivian appreciated. She ordered the same. "Tell me about the degree," she said when Denise had gone. He looked at her. "You want to start there?" "I want to start somewhere real." He was quiet for a moment. Outside through the window, a couple was arguing about something beside a parked car. Not seriously, gesturing and then laughing about it. Normal Saturday evening on Croft Street. "Elena was pregnant," he said. "My wife. I was in my final year. We'd planned it differently. She was supposed to finish her program first, then I'd finish mine, then we'd figure out kids in a few years, and then Lily decided to be earlier than expected." He said this with a flatness that had tenderness inside it, carefully contained. "I could have finished. In theory. Elena said I should. Her parents offered to help financially, but Elena was working and tired and I was 3 hours away at school, and I made a choice. You went home. I went home. I transferred to night classes, which didn't work with the site hours, and eventually I stopped and told myself I'd go back." He shrugged. "Then Lily was born, and it got real. And then Elena got sick." He stopped. "It was fast. 14 months from diagnosis to..." He stopped again. "Lily was 2. She doesn't remember, which is the right outcome for a 2-year-old and also the thing I find hardest." Vivian didn't say she was sorry. She'd said it at the dinner, and it was true, and repeating it would have made it about her response rather than his reality. She just let it be there. After that, he said, Going back to school stopped being a priority. I needed money consistently, and I needed to be available consistently, and the job I had gave me both, even if it gave me nothing else. He looked at his coffee cup. I'm not complaining. I made choices. They were the right choices. You designed a system that they filed under another engineer's name, she said. That engineer had the license. That's not the same as having the idea. He looked at her with a steadiness that she'd seen on the foundation platform and in the Glenfield meeting and outside the school. The particular quality of a man who'd made peace with the situation without pretending the situation was fair. No, he said, it's not the same. But I needed the job and he needed someone who could solve the problem, and that was the arrangement. It was transactional. I understood it as transactional. Did it bother you? Yes, he said, simply. But being bothered by it and doing something about it are different things. I had Lily. I had a mortgage on a 2-bedroom apartment. I had Mrs. Delgado downstairs who needed her faucets fixed and her groceries carried. You don't get to have a crisis of professional dignity when other people need you to just keep going. Vivian looked at him across the table in the warm light of Bellamy's and thought about the 14-story company she'd built in 8 years. The acquisitions and the zoning battles and the design awards and the Forbes profile that she'd cooperated with reluctantly and that had described her as ruthlessly brilliant, which had pleased her less than she'd expected. She thought about all of it and thought about this man who'd spent 8 years being the answer that never got credited, and she thought that the distance between their circumstances was large, but that the space between the ways they thought about problems was smaller than it should have been. The Glenfield project, she said. I want to talk to you about a role. He went still in a particular way. I'm not interested in charity. I know you're not. That's not what I'm offering. She leaned forward slightly. The design division on Glenfield doesn't have a lead who can do what you can do. The architect is strong, but she's not a structural thinker. The engineer of record is competent and completely incapable of creative problem solving. I need someone who can hold the whole system, structural, environmental, scheduling, crew relationships, in their head at once and make decisions that account for all of it simultaneously. That's not a job description, he said. That's a wish list. I know what I watched you do in that meeting, she said, and on the platform, and the window thing. You knew about the Georgia labor dispute from a phone call about something else, and you held on to that information and brought it into the room where it was relevant. That's not a skill you can hire for. It's a way of thinking. He was quiet. She could see him working through it. Not the ego part, not the flattery, but the actual substance. Whether it was real, whether the role was coherent, whether it was something he could do in a way that didn't compromise the other obligations that came first. Lily's school schedule doesn't change, he said. I know. I'm not going to take calls at 3 in the morning because someone in the office missed a deadline. I'll put that in the contract. He looked at her. You're serious. I've been serious about this since the Glenfield meeting. She held his gaze. I'm also sitting in a diner on a Saturday night eating meatloaf, which is not how I typically spend my time, so you can draw whatever conclusions you want about the seriousness level. Something happened in his face. Not a smile? Not quite. But the thing that comes before a smile in people who've learned to hold them back. The meatloaf is actually very good, he said. It is, she agreed. They ate. Denise refilled the coffee twice. Landon told her about Lily's current obsession with prehistoric megafauna, not just the Therizinosaurus, but the entire late Cretaceous ecosystem, which Lily had been researching with the systematic dedication of a small academic, and explaining to anyone who would hold still long enough to listen. Vivian discovered she knew almost nothing about prehistoric megafauna and found that she was genuinely interested, which she hadn't anticipated. She sounds like she's going to be formidable, Vivian said. She already is, Landon said. She's 6, and she already knows how to make an argument that I can't immediately counter. Last week she convinced me to let her stay up past bedtime by pointing out that I'd set the bedtime rule when she was 4, and that she was a materially different person now, and the rule should be renegotiated. What did you do? I gave her an extra 20 minutes and then spent the next 3 days wondering where she learned the phrase materially different. Vivian laughed. It was a real laugh. The kind that surprises you, that comes before you've decided to allow it. She was aware of Landon registering it, aware of the small shift in the quality of his attention. You have a good laugh, he said. I don't do it often enough. Why not? She thought about it honestly, which was the only kind of thinking she seemed able to do in this booth in this diner in front of this man. Because most professional environments punish it. Women who laugh easily in boardrooms get characterized as not serious. I adapted. That's a long time to adapt. 8 years. You started young. 22, she said. First acquisition. I walked into a room of men who were all at least 15 years older than me, and two of them laughed at something before the meeting started, and one of them stopped when I walked in and said, "Sorry, inside joke, we'll get started." And I realized in that moment that they weren't going to take me seriously unless I made them, and the way to make them was to be more serious than any of them could sustain. Landon looked at her steadily. Did it work? Commercially? Yes. That wasn't what I asked. She looked back at him. No, not entirely. He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was receiving information and filing it accurately rather than performing understanding. They finished dinner. Denise brought the check. Landon reached for it and Vivian put her hand on the table, not on his hand, beside it, and said, "Let me." "This is supposed to be a dinner between two people," she said. "Not a transaction. Let me." He left his hand where it was for a moment, and then he sat back. "Okay." She paid. They put on their coats. They walked out onto Croft Street where the cold had gotten serious now, their breath visible, the dry cleaner next door dark and gated, the hardware store still lit. They stood on the sidewalk. The moment had the particular quality of endings that aren't entirely endings. A natural pause in which both people are deciding something. "Thank you for this," Landon said. "For the meatloaf?" "For being straightforward," he said. "About what you wanted. Most people aren't. I found that pretending you don't want things doesn't make you want them less. It just makes everyone confused." He looked at her in the cold amber light of the street lamp, and she looked back, and the city moved around them the way cities do. Indifferent and continuous, and not particularly interested in the specific weight of any given moment. "The Glenfield roll," he said. "I want to think about it. Take the time you need. And the other thing," he said it carefully, the way careful people name things that are important to them. "I want to take that slowly." "Slowly is fine," she said. "Lily first, always." "I know," Vivian said. "I heard you the first time. I mean it." He looked at her for a moment longer with the measuring quality she'd seen on the job site and in the meetings and outside the school. The look that wasn't distrust but wasn't trust yet either. Just the honest middle space of someone who'd been disappointed enough times to have developed a responsible relationship with hope. "Good night, Vivian," he said. "Good night, Landon." He walked toward the corner. She stood on the sidewalk outside Bellamy's and watched him go and did not feel the urge to look away. He turned at the corner, and that was that. She stood there a moment longer in the cold. The city ran its Saturday evening business around her. Inside the diner behind her, Denise would be clearing the booth, stacking the plates with the efficient resignation of someone who'd done it 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more. Vivian walked to her car. She sat in it and turned on the heat and sat with the warmth building around her and thought about slowly and whether she was capable of it, and decided that for this she was willing to learn. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it expecting work. There was always work. And found instead a text from an unknown number. "Lily wants me to tell you that if you want to borrow the dinosaur book, she says you can keep it as long as you need." Her words, not edited. Vivian looked at the message for a long moment. Then she saved the number under his name and typed back, "Tell her I'll take very good care of it." 3 minutes passed. Then, "She says she knows you will. She also says the chapter on Therizinosaurus is the best one, but you should read the whole thing in order." Vivian started the car, still looking at the message, and then she put the phone down and drove home through the cold Saturday city and was aware, for the first time in longer than she could precisely name, of something that felt genuinely like the beginning of something worth being careful with. The dinosaur book came back to Landon's apartment 3 weeks later with a sticky note on the cover that said, "Chapter 7 was the most surprising, V." In handwriting that was precise and slightly angular, the handwriting of someone who'd taught themselves efficiency over elegance, and had good taste because Chapter 7 was about Quetzalcoatlus, the pterosaur with a wingspan the size of a small plane, which Lily considered criminally underappreciated by the general public. Landon put the note in the kitchen drawer where he kept things he wasn't ready to throw away and didn't have a category for yet. 3 weeks had passed since Bellamy's. He'd called twice, she'd called once, and they'd had 2 more dinners, one at a Thai place near the Meridian site that Ruiz had recommended, and that turned out to be excellent. One at his apartment because Mrs. Delgado had a cold and couldn't sit with Lily, and he'd offered to cook instead of canceling, which in retrospect he understood had been a significant decision dressed up as a logistical solution. She'd arrived with a bottle of wine she hadn't announced she was bringing, and she'd sat at his kitchen table while he made pasta and helped Lily with her reading homework, with the careful attention of someone who took the task seriously rather than performing seriousness. And Lily had explained the entire Cretaceous ecosystem to her without pausing for breath. And Vivian had asked follow-up questions that were specific enough that Lily had given her father a look that said, "I like this person as plainly as if she'd written it on the wall." Slowly, he'd told her. She was managing it mostly. He'd taken the Glenfield role. He'd told her on a Tuesday, in the parking lot after the Thai dinner, standing beside his truck in the cold. He'd said he'd thought about it, and he had conditions, and she'd said state them, and he'd stated them. School pickup was inviolable. He'd need flexibility on morning start times twice a week because of Lily's swim class schedule, and he was not going to attend any function that required him to represent Sterling Properties socially until he was ready to do that on his own terms. She'd agreed to all 3 without negotiating, which he'd expected her to do because Vivian Sterling's tells were subtle, but he was starting to learn them. And one of them was that when she'd already made a decision, she stopped performing deliberation. He'd given notice at the Meridian site the next morning. Ruiz had looked at him for a long moment and then said good, in a tone that meant he'd been waiting for something like this to happen, and was relieved it finally had. The city project manager had sent a stiffly worded email about transition timelines that Landon had handled with the same patience he applied to foundation defects, methodically and without drama. His first week at Sterling Properties Design Division office was an education in a different kind of infrastructure. The office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, glass and reclaimed wood, and the deliberate casualness of expensive design, the kind of workspace that communicated creative confidence to anyone who walked in. His desk was near a window that looked south toward the waterfront. The team he'd inherited, 4 people, ranging from genuinely talented to earnestly mediocre, received him with the cautious courtesy of people who'd heard things about him but weren't sure yet what category to put him in. Within 2 weeks, they'd figured it out. Not because he'd announced anything about himself, but because he was in early and available. And when he looked at their work, he said specific things rather than general ones. And when he identified a problem, he proposed a solution in the same breath. And when someone on the team had a good idea, he said so directly and didn't absorb it into a group decision. These were not remarkable qualities in the abstract. In the specific environment of a company where credit had historically flowed upward, they were unusual enough to register. Ferris, the architect, came to him in the 3rd week about the East Zone structural redesign, the load redistribution solution he'd outlined in the Glenfield meeting. She spread the revised plans on the work table in his office and walked him through her implementation and waited for his response with the wariness of a talented person who's been criticized by people less talented than herself too many times. He looked at the plans for 4 minutes. She stood across the table. "This works," he said. "Better than what I outlined in the meeting, actually. The way you've resolved the transfer structure at this junction," he pointed, "is cleaner than what I was thinking. You fixed a problem I didn't know I'd created." Ferris looked at him. Then she looked at the plans. Then she looked back at him. "Harris used to say good effort and then change things," she said. "Harris wasn't an engineer." "No." She rolled the plans up slowly. "He was a manager." "Those are different jobs," Landon said. "You're an architect. I'm here to make sure your ideas can be built, not to have better ideas than you." Ferris left his office with the particular energy of someone who'd expected a transaction and received something else. He didn't think much about it. He had 7 other things on the work table and a call with the structural engineer of record in 20 minutes and a note from Vivian's assistant about a materials procurement question he needed to review before end of day. This was the shape of his life now. Different and not entirely comfortable yet. The newness of it had a friction that he didn't pretend wasn't there, but real in the way that mattered. He was doing work that used the actual capacity of his mind, not a portion of it, that had a quality he hadn't experienced in a long time. The quality of a machine running at the right speed instead of being throttled back to prevent something from overheating. Vivian had done this. He understood that and held it honestly, without letting the gratitude tip into something that would change the balance between them. She hadn't given him an opportunity out of generosity. She'd identified a resource that her company needed and had placed it correctly, and the fact that the resource happened to be a person she was also having dinner with on Saturdays was a complication she managed by keeping the professional and personal channels clearly separated during work hours. He respected that. He did the same. They were careful with each other, the way people are careful when they understand that something is fragile not because it's weak, but because it's real. December arrived with the first serious snow, which Lily treated as a personal gift and Landon treated as a structural risk assessment. He spent the first snowfall worrying about the Glenfield site's temporary weather protection and texted Cook at 6:30 a.m. to check the cover status on the exposed foundation work. Cook texted back a photograph of the site, fully covered, with the caption, "Already done, boss. Get some sleep." Landon stared at the word boss for a moment with a feeling he didn't name, then put the phone down and made Lily's breakfast. Vivian came to Lily's school winter concert on a Thursday evening in mid-December. Landon hadn't invited her exactly. He'd mentioned it the previous Saturday in the way people mention things when they're testing the water without admitting they're testing it. Lily has her winter concert Thursday. She's been practicing Jingle Bells on the recorder for 3 weeks, and I've developed significant coping mechanisms. And Vivian had said, "What time does it start?" And he'd told her, and she'd said, "I'll be there if I can. Don't tell Lily in case I can't make it." And he'd said, "Okay," and then spent 2 days not thinking about it, which was his version of thinking about it constantly. She arrived 4 minutes before the concert started, which meant she'd come from work and hadn't changed and was still in her coat from the office. And she slid into the seat beside him in the third row of the school gymnasium with a whispered apology that he waved off. On his other side, Mrs. Delgado was wearing her good cardigan and had brought a tin of cookies that she'd distributed to everyone within arm's reach, because Mrs. Delgado treated all public gatherings as opportunities for community building. "You made it," Landon said quietly. "Parking was terrible," Vivian said. "There's no good parking within 4 blocks of this school. There's never good parking. You get used to it. I drove around for 12 minutes. Next time add 15 to your estimate." She looked at him with a glimmer of something. "Next time." The concert was everything a second-grade recorder concert was. Earnest and cacophonous, and completely earnest in its cacophony. 22 children with instruments they'd been playing for 11 weeks producing sounds that bore a family resemblance to music without being music in any technical sense. Lily was in the second row, braids done properly tonight because Landon had recruited Mrs. Delgado, wearing a red sweater that was slightly too big for her because she'd picked it herself and she'd picked it for the color. When Lily's section played, Lily played with the focused ferocity of someone who'd practiced this specific thing for 3 weeks and intended to do it correctly. She did not look at the audience. She looked at her fingers and the instrument and the sheet music, and when she hit the right note at the right time, she made a small private nod of satisfaction that Landon recognized immediately because he did the exact same thing when a structural calculation resolved cleanly. Beside him, Vivian was very still. He glanced at her. She was watching Lily with an expression he'd only seen on her face a few times. Not the composed professional attention she deployed in meetings, not the careful openness she brought to their dinners. Something quieter than either, something that hadn't quite been managed into form yet. He looked away before she noticed him looking. Afterward, in the gymnasium corridor, while parents collected children and children ran in directions their parents hadn't intended, Lily found them and stopped in front of Vivian with the direct assessment she applied to everything. "You came," she said. "I came," Vivian confirmed. "Did you hear us play?" "I heard the whole thing." "Which part did you like?" Vivian considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "When your section played, you were in the second row." Lily's expression shifted into something that was trying not to be pleased and failing. "I practiced a lot," she said. "I know. Your dad told me." Lily looked at her father. He offered nothing. She looked back at Vivian. "Next time we're going to learn hot cross buns," she said. "It has more notes than Jingle Bells. It's more complicated." "I look forward to it," Vivian said. Mrs. Delgado appeared at Landon's elbow and handed him the cookie tin and told him she was getting a ride home with her daughter, and pressed both his hands in hers for a moment, and looked at Vivian with a warm and entirely unsubtle approval that Landon pretended not to notice. Mrs. Delgado had opinions about his personal life that she expressed through eye contact and the strategic deployment of baked goods. They walked out into the December night, the three of them, Lily between them with her recorder case and her backpack, narrating her assessment of the concert as they went. She had notes on the performances of specific classmates, offered with the diplomatic honesty of a child who'd been raised to be truthful without being cruel. A boy named Felix had been very brave because he'd had a hard time in practice but had tried anyway. A girl named Priya had been the best in the whole second row, and Lily thought this was because Priya practiced at home every day, which Lily had confirmed through investigation. Investigation, Landon said. What investigation? I asked her, Lily said, as though this were obvious. They reached the parking area. Vivian's car was parked 2 rows from Landon's truck. The 12 minutes of circling had at least produced a reasonable spot. Lily stopped and looked up at Vivian. Are you coming to our apartment? Not tonight, Lilybug, Landon said. Lily processed this. She wasn't disappointed exactly. She had the flexibility of a child who understood that adults had logistics. But she was considering. Okay, she said finally. Then to Vivian, you can come another time. I'd like that, Vivian said. Lily nodded, satisfied, and went to the truck and climbed in with the determined self-sufficiency of a child who'd been getting herself into vehicle back seats for 2 years and considered assistance an insult. Landon turned to Vivian. The parking lot was bright and cold, other families moving through it around them, the night ordinary in all the ways that made moments inside it feel more significant by contrast. Thank you for coming, he said. I wanted to. I know you wanted to. I'm still thanking you for it. She looked at him with the directness she had when she wasn't managing anything. She practiced for 3 weeks and she did it correctly, and she knew it. That nod she made when she got the note right. I know, he said. She's something, Landon. Yeah, he said, she is. They stood in the cold for a moment. From the truck, muffled through the window, Lily was audible, talking to herself or to the recorder case, or to some audience only she could see, conducting some internal monologue about the evening. He looked at Vivian, and she looked at him, and the thing between them was present in the way it had been building for weeks. Not dramatized, not performed, just there. Real and accumulating, the way structural loads accumulate, quietly and consistently, until they've created something that holds. Slowly, he said. Not a reminder. More like an acknowledgement that the word still applied, and that he was still asking for it. Slowly, she said. I know. Bartel. January brought the Glenfield groundbreaking, which was technically a re-groundbreaking since the project had been started and stalled twice. But Sterling's communications team had reframed it with the particular confidence of people whose job was reframing. There were journalists, city officials, a deputy mayor who shook hands efficiently and left before the cold settled in. There were photographs of Vivian with a ceremonial shovel that she held with the contained impatience of someone who found ceremonial shovels philosophically insufficient. Landon stood near the back with Ferris and Cook and the structural engineer of record, a meticulous man named Dr. Osei, who wore a wool coat that was 3 sizes too large for him, and who had spent the previous 6 weeks going over every element of Landon's load redistribution design with the comprehensive skepticism of someone whose professional reputation was being attached to another person's solution. He'd found 2 things worth revising and had revised them, and had sent Landon a detailed memo about each. And Landon had read the memos carefully and agreed with both and said so, which had produced in Dr. Osei a visible and profound relief. After the ceremony, the deputy mayor gone and the journalists dispersing, Vivian worked the remaining cluster of city officials with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. Engaged, direct, memory for names and context that she deployed without apparent effort. Landon watched her operate in that environment and understood, clearly and without illusion, what he was watching. She was exceptional at this. Not just competent, genuinely skilled in the way that requires both intelligence and the specific willingness to show up fully in rooms that other people made uncomfortable or high stakes. She didn't perform confidence. She just was it, at whatever temperature the situation required. He thought about the dinner at Ashwood and Pine, Marcus's table, the careful architecture of that evening designed to reduce him to an anecdote. He thought about how Vivian had sat at that table and done her own assessment. He thought about the personnel file she'd pulled that night, and the Glenfield meeting the next day, and the parking lot of Sycamore Elementary, and Bellamy's Diner, and the kitchen table, and the winter concert, and he thought that the accumulation of those things had a weight he couldn't pretend not to feel. She caught his eye across the remaining crowd. It was brief, a glance, nothing more. But she'd registered where he was, and she'd looked, which was its own information. He looked back. Then he turned to Dr. Osei and asked about the revised load calculations on Section 4, and the morning continued. February came, and with it a problem. His name was Garrett Shields, and he was Sterling Properties' chief operating officer, and he had been in that role for 4 years. And he had opinions about the Glenfield project's design direction that he'd been accumulating since Landon's arrival, with the patient displeasure of a man who considered the situation an imposition on an order he'd been comfortable with. Shields was 54, Stanford MBA, silver-haired in a way that suggested curatorship rather than aging, and he ran the operational side of Sterling Properties with the rigorous efficiency of someone who valued systems above all other things, including the people inside them. He was not incompetent. He was the reason the company's logistics ran correctly, and its vendor contracts were consistently favorable, and its financial reporting was meticulous. He was also the reason the design division had been organized around compliance rather than innovation for the better part of 3 years. He appeared in Landon's office on a Wednesday morning in February with a manila folder and a specific kind of professional courtesy that Landon recognized immediately as the kind that precedes something you're not going to like. "The Glenfield materials procurement," Shields said, setting the folder on Landon's desk without being invited to sit, though he sat anyway. "I've reviewed your alternate specification for the upper floor window units. The cost differential versus the original specification is significant. 14% per unit," Landon said, "but the original supplier has a delivery timeline that now pushes our completion date by 10 to 12 weeks. The alternate specification maintains our schedule. The alternate specification is from a manufacturer we haven't worked with before. I've done due diligence on them. Their quality record is strong. 3 independent reviews and site visits to 2 of their completed installations." Landon opened his own file. "I sent you the full report on January 23rd. "I received the report," Shields said. "My concern is the relationship. Sterling has a long-standing relationship with Vantage Glazing. Changing specifications on a flagship project sends a signal." "What signal?" Shields looked at him with the patience of someone managing a person who was asking a question they both knew the answer to. "That we're willing to change established relationships when they become inconvenient. They're causing a 12-week delay on a $90 million project," Landon said. "That's not inconvenient. That's a material breach of their delivery commitments. These things happen in construction. They don't have to happen in this construction." Landon closed his file. "What's the real concern, Garrett?" Shields looked at him. The use of the first name was deliberate. Landon had noticed early on that Shields operated in a formal register and that departing from it slightly produced a recalibration in the conversation. "The real concern," Shields said, with a precision that told Landon he'd been waiting to say this clearly, "is that you've been in this role for 8 weeks and you're proposing changes to established vendor relationships, established design protocols, and established team structures that have existed for years. And the reason those changes are being approved is not purely operational." The room was quiet. "Say what you mean," Landon said. "Ms. Sterling approves your recommendations with a speed she doesn't apply to other division leads," Shields said. "That's observable. It's been observed." Landon was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't have a response, but because he was deciding what kind of response was worth making. The anger was there. He was aware of it as a physical thing, a tightening across the shoulders. But anger deployed in this kind of conversation would give Shields exactly what he was looking for, which was evidence that Landon was operating outside professional boundaries. "Every recommendation I've made," Landon said, "is documented with technical justification. The load redistribution solution was reviewed and approved by Dr. Osei, the engineer of record. The window specification change is supported by a 30-page procurement analysis. The team restructuring was done in consultation with Ferris and ratified by HR." He kept his voice level. If you have a technical objection to any of those decisions, I want to hear it. I have a structural objection, Shields said, to the situation. The situation isn't my concern, Landon said. The building is. Shields stood. He picked up his folder. He looked at Landon with the expression of a man who was recalibrating his timeline rather than abandoning his position. I'll be raising this with Ms. Sterling directly, he said. That's your right, Landon said. Shields left. Landon sat at his desk and looked at the surface of it for a moment. The plans, the procurement analysis, the coffee cup that had been full an hour ago, and ran through the conversation with the same systematic attention he gave to structural reviews. He was looking for where he'd been wrong, if he'd been wrong, because if he had, he needed to know it. He found one thing. He should have invited Shields into the January 23rd report discussion rather than sending it unilaterally. That was a process error. Not a technical error, a political one, and he didn't love that he'd made it because political errors in institutional environments had a half-life that technical errors didn't. He called Vivian that evening after Lily was in bed. He told her about the conversation with Shields, specifically and completely, without editorializing. She was quiet for a moment on the other end. He's not wrong that I approve your recommendations quickly, she said. I know. But he is wrong about why. I know that too, but knowing it and demonstrating it are different problems. What do you want to do? She asked. Not what was she going to do, not what was her plan. What did he want to do? He appreciated that. I want to bring Shields into the next procurement review as a co-presenter. Let him own the process visibility. His concern is about being outside the loop on decisions that have operational implications. That's actually a legitimate concern, even if his framing of it wasn't. A pause. You're going to give him a seat at the table after he implied your work is being approved for personal reasons. I'm going to give him a seat at the table because he's the COO and the project has operational dimensions that benefit from his involvement, Landon said. What he implied is his business. The work is mine. Another pause. Longer. That's either very mature or very strategic. Can it be both? He could hear something in the silence that might have been a smile. Yes, she said. It can be both. He brought Shields into the February procurement review. He sent him the documentation in advance, asked for his input specifically on vendor relationship management, and when the meeting happened, he deferred to Shields on 2 process questions that were legitimately in the COO's domain and held his ground on 3 technical questions that weren't. Shields participated with a controlled surprise that Landon recognized as grudging respect from a man who hadn't expected it and wasn't sure what to do with it. They didn't become allies, but the active friction dropped to the level of professional wariness, which was manageable. Landon had worked in environments his entire career where someone in authority viewed him with wariness. He knew how to build inside that constraint. You did the work correctly and you let the work speak, and you didn't need the other person to become a friend in order to function. March came. The Glenfield Foundation work cleared its first significant inspection. Not just passed, but received a written commendation from the city structural inspector. A rare enough event that Ferris brought it to the morning meeting and set it on the table and looked at Landon with the expression of someone who'd spent years waiting for their work to be validated externally. Frame it, Landon told her. I don't have anything to frame it in. I'll get a frame, he said. He got a frame that afternoon, stopped at the hardware store 2 blocks from the office, plain wood, and brought it back and left it on her desk. She didn't mention it. 3 days later, it was on the wall outside her office, the inspection commendation in it, and she'd added a small typed label at the bottom that said Glenfield Sustainable Housing Project, Phase 1, Design Division, not Ferris, not Pierce, just the project and the team. He looked at it for a moment and then went back to his desk and called the window manufacturer about the revised delivery schedule, which was running 2 days ahead of the original projection. But, spring came in the way. Spring comes to cities, not all at once, but in installments. A warm week followed by a cold week. The trees making tentative decisions about leaves, the light staying longer each evening in a way that was noticeable and then felt necessary. The Glenfield project was vertical now. The foundation done. The structural frame rising, the shape of what it was going to be becoming legible against the sky. Vivian came to the site on a Thursday in April, not for a meeting, not for an inspection, just to look at it. Landon found her standing on the south perimeter, hard hat on, looking up at the structural frame with an expression he'd seen her wear in front of the Glenfield blueprints, and in front of Dr. Osei's revised calculations, and in the winter concert gymnasium. The expression of a person who is receiving something real and letting it land. He stood beside her. "It's going to be good," she said. "Yes," he said. "The families who live here." She paused. "I want it to feel like somewhere they chose, not somewhere they ended up." He looked at the frame. The unit layouts have full-height windows on the south face. Ferris pushed for them against the cost calculations, and she was right to push. "The light will be good." "I know. I approved them." "I know you did." She turned to look at him. The April light was different from November light, softer, more willing, the kind of light that had some warmth in it. She looked tired today, the productive tired of someone who'd been running hard and hadn't stopped, and she looked like herself, which was not always the same thing. "How's Lily?" she asked. She started drawing dinosaur comics, sequential panels, narrative arc, the whole thing. She showed me 12 pages last night and then fell asleep in the middle of explaining the plot. Vivian smiled. The real one. The one she'd told him she didn't use enough in the diner back in November when they'd been at the beginning of something that was now considerably further along. "She showed me 4 pages last weekend," Vivian said. He looked at her. "She showed you pages?" "At the kitchen table, when I came for dinner." Vivian looked back at the frame. She wanted an outside opinion. She said dads are biased reviewers. He was quiet for a moment, processing this. Not just the fact of it, but the ease with which Vivian said it, the way it sat inside her like something ordinary rather than something calculated. She'd been coming to dinner more often. Not every week. She traveled. He had nights when Lily needed him to be only a father and nothing else. There were still careful spaces maintained. But more often, and with an ease that had grown in the way real ease grows, which is not all at once but steadily, until the effort of maintaining it is less than the effort of not having it. Lily called Vivian by her name. Not a title, not an honorific. Vivian. She'd started doing it naturally, without being told, the way children absorb and apply the correct taxonomy of people in their world. She hadn't asked Landon where Vivian fit. She seemed to be answering that question for herself, in her own terms, at her own speed. He trusted her to do that. She'd always been better at reading people than he was. 4 pages, he said. She's got a good instinct for pacing, Vivian said. The dinosaur villain, the Carnotaurus, she's giving him real motivation. He's not just bad, he has a reason. She told me it's because he was left out of things when he was young, and it made him mean, Landon said. That's emotionally sophisticated for a 7-year-old. She's been 7 for 3 weeks, and she's already using it to its full potential. He paused. Her birthday is in June. She's already negotiating the terms. What are the current terms? A dinosaur-themed party with a cake that is accurate to the Cretaceous period, whatever that means. A specific book about pterosaur aerodynamics that she identified herself. And this is the negotiation part. She wants to go to the Natural History Museum in the city, which she's been asking about for 2 years, and she wants to go with... He stopped for a beat. With both of us. The frame of the building stood above them against the April sky. A crane moved somewhere on the north side, a slow, deliberate arc. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Not the careful quiet of someone deciding whether to agree to something. The quiet of someone letting themselves feel something without immediately organizing it. Both of us, she said. That's what she said. He looked at Vivian. I told her I'd ask. She looked at him. The morning light was doing the thing it did now that the angle had changed with the season, catching the particular quality of her attention in a way that he'd stopped trying to look past and had simply started looking at. Yes, she said. Okay. Obviously yes, Landon. I know, he said. I wanted to hear you say it. She looked back at the building frame and he looked at it too, both of them standing on the muddy south perimeter of a project that was becoming the thing it had been designed to be. Imperfect in the way real construction is imperfect, marked by the decisions of the specific people who'd made it, carrying inside its structure the solutions to problems that had seemed unsolvable before someone with the right kind of mind looked at them clearly. Above them, the frame rose against the sky, floor by floor, the future of it becoming visible in the shape of its bones. Around them, the city ran its April business, indifferent, continuous, full of people carrying things they didn't talk about to places that mattered to them for reasons they couldn't always articulate. And beside him, in muddy boots and a matte black hard hat with the logo carefully covered, Vivian Sterling stood with her hands in her coat pockets and looked at what they were building and said nothing more, because nothing more needed to be said. And they stood there together in the ordinary morning until the crane finished its arc and the site resumed its noise and the day, like all days, made its persistent claim on their attention. The Natural History Museum was larger than Lily had anticipated, which she announced within 40 seconds of walking through the entrance doors, looking up at the vaulted ceiling with the expression of someone revising a significant internal estimate. "It's bigger than I thought," she said. "How big did you think it was?" Landon asked. "I thought it was big." She turned in a slow circle, taking inventory. "This is bigger than big." Vivian looked at Landon over Lily's head. He looked back. This had become a thing between them. The silent exchange above the 7-year-old's awareness, the shared registration of whatever Lily said or did that was specifically, exactly herself. It wasn't a performance of parental partnership. It was just the natural consequence of two adults who'd been paying attention to the same person for long enough that they'd developed a shared language around her. Lily's birthday had been on a Saturday in June, warm and clear in the way June Saturdays occasionally commit to being. The party had happened the day before. 11 children in the backyard of Landon's building, a Cretaceous-themed spread that Mrs. Delgado had helped organize and that Vivian had contributed a cake to, a 3-tier construction with a topographic landscape across the top, and a fondant therizinosaurus that Lily had examined with the critical eye of a consultant reviewing technical specifications before declaring it accurate enough to be satisfactory. Marcus had not been invited. This had required no discussion. The museum trip was the birthday gift Lily had negotiated for herself. She'd been patient about it in the way she was patient about things she wanted very much, but not pestering, just maintaining a steady, calm pressure of expectation, the way a river maintains pressure on a bank. She'd brought a notebook. She'd also brought the pterosaur aerodynamics book in her backpack because she intended to compare the museum's display information against the book's claims, and she was, she'd informed Landon, prepared for discrepancies. They moved through the entrance hall toward the Cretaceous wing, which was where Lily intended to begin and also end, with possible detours to other periods if the evidence warranted them. She walked between Landon and Vivian with the easy proprietary confidence of a child who has decided that a situation is correct and doesn't require further analysis. This was the thing about Lily that Landon had come to understand more deeply over the past months. She didn't process people through the filters that adults spent their lives constructing. She took them in directly, assessed them on the evidence of behavior rather than category, and made her determinations with a clarity that adults had mostly lost. She determined that Vivian was someone who listened when you talked, who gave real answers to real questions, who didn't speak to her in the simplified register that some adults deployed with children, as though childhood were a cognitive limitation rather than a developmental stage. Lily had made her determination sometime around November, around the time of the hot chocolate and the lollipop on Croft Street, and she'd been operating on that determination ever since with the consistency of someone who didn't see a reason to revisit a settled conclusion. The Cretaceous exhibit was everything it needed to be. A mounted T-Rex skeleton near the entrance that Lily walked past, with the slightly superior air of someone who'd moved beyond the obvious. Hadrosaur specimens, a Triceratops skull, the atmospheric lighting of a room designed to suggest geological time. And in the far corner, in a display case that Lily found within 3 minutes of entering the room, a mounted skeleton of a therizinosaurus forelimb with the 3-foot claws extended, accompanied by interpretive text that she read standing on her toes with her nose 6 inches from the glass. She read for 4 minutes. Landon and Vivian stood behind her and did not rush her. Then she turned around with the notebook open. "The display says they use the claws for pulling down branches," she said. "The book says it's still debated whether it was primarily for feeding or for defense. The display doesn't mention the debate." "What do you think the explanation is?" Vivian asked. Lily considered this seriously. Museum displays have to be simple because a lot of people read them and they can't put in all the information. But that means some people leave with incomplete ideas. She wrote something in her notebook. "I'm going to put the debate in my comic so my readers know." "Your comic has readers?" Landon asked. "It will," Lily said, with the serene certainty of someone whose timeline extended further than the present moment. She moved on to the next display. Landon watched her go. Vivian touched his arm briefly. Not dramatically, just the contact that people make when they want to mark a moment without making a speech about it. "She's going to be something," Vivian said, the same thing she'd said at the winter concert, and still true, and said now with the particular quality of someone who'd had months to observe the evidence accumulating. "She already is," he said. The same thing he'd said then. They followed her through the rest of the Cretaceous wing and then through a detour into the Jurassic period that Lily authorized after examining the displays and finding them more interesting than expected, and then through the human evolution section where Lily stopped at a display about early tool use and said, with complete seriousness, that it was interesting how much human progress had depended on figuring out how to build things, which made Landon clear his throat and look at a display about prehistoric Africa. "Lily's schedule doesn't change. I know. We'd build the structure around it. Not as a favor, as a management decision. The work gets better when the people doing it aren't burning their lives to produce it. That's been true at every scale I've operated at." He looked at her. She was 31 now. She'd turned 31 in March, quietly. She didn't make much of birthdays. And she looked like herself, the version of herself that had been emerging over the past 8 months, which was related to but not identical to the woman who'd walked into Ashwood and Pine in October. Something had relaxed. Not the capability, not the focus. Those were constants. But around the edges of things, in the way she sat across from him in a museum cafe on a Saturday afternoon eating a sandwich without checking her phone, there was a settledness that hadn't been there before. He thought about what she'd told him in Bellamy's back at the beginning, that she'd taught herself not to laugh in boardrooms, and that it had worked commercially, but not entirely. He thought about the laugh he'd heard from her in the months since, specific instances he could locate precisely, the Thai restaurant when Ruiz had called with an absurd sight problem at 9 p.m., the kitchen table when Lily had explained her theory of biased reviewers, the Glenfield site in April when a pigeon had walked across the plans with a complete indifference to its historical significance. She laughed more now. He noticed it the way you notice when something that was rationed becomes available. "Yes," he said, "I'll lead it." She nodded. No celebration, no performance of relief, just the nod of someone who'd had a conversation, gotten a real answer, and could now move forward. Lily came back from the restroom with her notebook and sat down and looked between them with the focused assessment of a child who could sense when adults had discussed something. "Were you talking about something?" she asked. "Work," Landon said. Lily considered whether this was satisfactory. "Okay," she said, and picked up the rest of her grilled cheese. The thing about the months that followed was that they were not remarkable in the way that stories often require things to be remarkable. There was no single crisis, no dramatic confrontation, no moment where everything nearly fell apart and was then saved by an exceptional act. What there was instead was the accumulated weight of ordinary days, which is actually the more demanding kind of story to live, because it has no climax to organize itself around and no resolution that arrives from outside. You have to build it yourself, incrementally, from materials that are mostly mundane. Landon led the Westgate project and did it the way he did everything, by understanding the system completely before proposing changes to it, by building the trust of the people working inside it before asking anything of them, by being available in the specific way that good leadership requires, which is not omnipresence, but the reliable quality of your attention when you're present. He brought Ferris across as the lead architect. He kept Dr. Osei as structural engineer of record. He added 2 people to the team, a young engineer named Abby, who'd been underutilized in another division, and a project coordinator named Dennis, who'd been managing logistics for Sterling's commercial side for 6 years and knew where everybody was buried and how to make sure they stayed there. He was honest with his team about what he didn't know, which was an unusual enough quality in leadership that it produced a disproportionate response. People became more honest with him in return, which meant problems surfaced earlier, which meant they were smaller by the time they needed solving. Shields observed this from his operational distance and made no further formal complaints, which was the closest thing to endorsement that Landon expected from him, and accepted as sufficient. Mrs. Delgado's hip got worse in September. Landon rearranged his schedule for 2 weeks to be available during her recovery, and when she protested, he told her that she'd been his emergency contact on Lily's school forms for 3 years, and that emergency contacts had obligations in both directions. She cried a little, which embarrassed both of them, and he fixed her towel rack while he was there because it had been loose since July, and she'd mentioned it only once, which meant she'd been managing around it. Vivian sent Mrs. Delgado a card and a very good soup from a restaurant downtown, which Mrs. Delgado told Landon made her feel like a person of consequence, which was, Mrs. Delgado explained, a different and better feeling than being taken care of. Lily turned 8 in June of the following year and had strong opinions about it. The dinosaur comics had accumulated into a collection of 63 pages, she'd counted, and she'd shown all of them to Vivian over the course of several visits, narrating each installment with the patience of an author who'd waited a long time for the right audience. Vivian had read every page and asked questions about specific narrative choices, and Lily had answered with the seriousness of a professional. One evening, in October, a full year after the blind dinner at Ashwood and Pine, Landon was sitting at his kitchen table with the Westgate structural drawings when Lily appeared beside him in her pajamas, which meant she'd been in bed and then decided she hadn't been ready to be in bed. "You're supposed to be asleep," he said. "I was thinking," she said. "About what?" She climbed into the chair beside him, which she'd been doing since she was old enough to climb into chairs, and looked at the drawings with the focused interest she applied to everything that was being built or constructed or assembled. "About Vivian," she said. He set his pencil down. "What about her?" Lily looked at the drawings. She had his sister's directness when it came to important things. His sister, who lived in Portland and called on Sundays and had been saying for months that she needed to come visit, and Landon kept saying yes, whenever you want, not quite ready to introduce the whole shape of his life to someone who'd known him since before any of this was its shape. "She makes you different," Lily said. "Different how?" Lily thought about this with the serious grammatical care she brought to precise things. "You used to be mostly tired," she said. "You were still good, but you were tired underneath everything. Now you're less tired." He looked at his daughter in her pajamas in the kitchen light. 8 years old, dark braids, the expression of a person who's been paying closer attention than the adults around her realized. "I didn't know you noticed," he said. "I notice things," she said. "I just don't always say them." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the October city ran its nighttime business, distant and continuous, the permanent backdrop. "Are you happy about that?" he asked. "About Vivian." Lily looked at him with the slightly patient expression she used when adults ask questions whose answers seemed obvious to her. "Yes," she said. "She listens. And she doesn't pretend things are simpler than they are." She paused. "And she read all 63 pages of my comic and remembered the details." "That's your standard," he said. "It's a good standard." He reached over and fixed the collar of her pajama top, which had been folded incorrectly. She submitted to this with the tolerant dignity of a child who understands that parents require these small gestures of care and that providing them costs nothing. "Go to sleep," he said. "Okay." She got down from the chair. At the kitchen doorway, she stopped. "Dad." "Yeah." "You should tell her," she said. "Whatever you're waiting to tell her, you should just tell her." Then she went back to bed with the decisiveness of someone who'd said the necessary thing and considered the matter closed. He sat at the kitchen table with the Westgate drawings for another 20 minutes. Then he put the drawings away. He told her on a Sunday in November, which made it exactly 13 months after the dinner at Ashwood and Pine, though he hadn't planned it that way and only realized the coincidence afterward. They were in the community garden at the Glenfield site. The project had been completed in September, 48 units occupied. Families moved in. The garden installed in October as the last element of the design. It had been Landon's addition to the plans, proposed late in the process, a half-acre of shared green space with raised beds and a seating area and string lights that the residents had asked for and that had required a small budget reallocation that SHis had approved with only minor resistance. The garden had the imperfect quality of things that are just beginning. Some of the plantings still thin, the soil settling, a few of the raised beds not yet claimed by any of the families. It would take time to become what it was going to be. That was fine. That was how things became. It was late afternoon, the light the color of copper, the way November light sometimes is for an hour before it gives up for the day. From the building above them came the ordinary sounds of families in apartments. A television, someone's music, a child's voice raised and then quieted. Real life, in the building he'd designed to hold it. Vivian was looking up at the building. She did this sometimes, came to the Glenfield site, and stood in the garden and looked at the building with an expression he'd learned to read as something between satisfaction and disbelief. The expression of a person who'd wanted something for a long time and still wasn't entirely convinced it was real. The Okafor family in 4C put plants on their balcony already, she said. I saw them last week. I know. Ferns, I think. And something with red flowers. He paused. Lily wants to come see it. She says she has a right to inspect what she helped design. She didn't help design it. She sat next to me for approximately 40 hours of plan review and offered commentary on the window proportions in Unit 2A. She considers that participatory. Vivian smiled. Then she looked at him, and the smile changed quality. Not smaller, just reoriented toward the present moment rather than the building. He said, I love you. The words sat in the garden in the copper afternoon light. Not dramatically, just there, the way real things are there. Without fanfare, without the performance that movies have trained people to expect around important statements. Just a man telling a woman the true thing, in a garden he'd helped build, on a Sunday afternoon in November. She looked at him. Her expression went through something. Not surprise exactly, but the careful opening of a door she'd been standing beside for a while, not quite turning the handle. I know, she said. Then, I love you too. She said it the way she said things that were true and important, directly, without decoration, with the full weight of her attention behind it. He nodded. She nodded. It was not a dramatic exchange, and it was the most important one either of them had had in years, and they both knew it, and neither of them made it into a performance. I've been thinking about something, he said. You think about things constantly. You need to narrow it down. The degree, he said. The civil engineering degree. 3 credits. She was quiet. The licensing board has a continuing education track for people with extensive field experience, he said. I looked into it 6 months ago and then didn't say anything because I wasn't sure I was ready to say it out loud. What changed? Lily told me to stop waiting to say things. Vivian looked at him with an expression that was complicated in a way he'd come to love about her. Never simple, never performing simplicity, always the actual thing. She said that? In those words. In her pajamas. At the kitchen table. She's 8. She's been running ahead of her age since she was 4. He looked at Vivian steadily. If I pursue the license, it changes the shape of the role. I'd be able to be the engineer of record on my own projects. I'd be able to take on things that, he paused, that I've been handing to other people for 8 years. What do you need? Time. The program is 18 months with night and weekend coursework. Mrs. Delgado is better now. And, he stopped. And, she said, and I've stopped being afraid that wanting something means I'll lose something else. He looked at her in the copper light. That was the thing for a long time. If I wanted something for myself, it felt like it was coming at Lily's expense. Like there was only a fixed amount of good things available and wanting more of them was greedy. Vivian looked at him with the absolute focus she brought to things that required it. That's not greed, she said. That's just being alive. I know that now. He paused. I know it more now. She reached over and put her hand in his, which she did sometimes with the ease of people who've stopped having to decide to touch each other. Do it, she said. The degree. Do it. I plan to. Good. She looked at the building again. Lily is going to be insufferable about it. She's going to claim she told you so. She did tell me so. Then she'll be accurately insufferable, which is the worst kind. He laughed. The real kind. The kind that doesn't ask permission. They married the following October on a Saturday, which was the day that had come to belong to them in the accumulated logic of the past 2 years. The day of Bellamy's and the museum, and the garden, and all the ordinary Saturdays in between that had done the actual work of building something real. The ceremony was at the Glenfield Community Garden, which the building's residents had agreed to immediately when Vivian's assistant had asked, and which several of them had decorated with an enthusiastic thoroughness that had not been anticipated. There were more string lights than the original plan. The Okafor family from 4C brought plants from their balcony and arranged them along the aisle. A man named Torres from 2B, who turned out to have a very good singing voice, performed 2 songs unprompted, which caused Landon's mother to cry before anything official had even started. Landon's parents had come from Ohio, his father in a suit he'd clearly had for 20 years, and wore with the comfort of a man who was not concerned about fashion, his mother in blue, both of them looking at their son with the expression of people who'd hoped for something and were watching it arrive. His sister had flown in from Portland and had met Vivian the night before at a dinner that had gone well in the specific way that good things go well. Not dramatically, not perfectly, but genuinely. His sister had pulled him aside afterward and said, "She's real," and he'd said, "I know," and that had been the whole review. Vivian's side was smaller. Her parents had divorced when she was 12 and maintained the functional cordiality of people who had jointly produced something they were both proud of and had agreed to focus on that. They sat on the same side and did not make it a thing. Vivian's closest friend, a woman named Rachel, who'd been her college roommate and was currently a landscape architect in Denver, had flown in and stood beside her and had managed to maintain composure until the vows, and then had not maintained it, which she had predicted accurately in the bridal getting ready conversation and had accepted as an inevitability. Ferris was there, with her husband. Dr. Osei was there, still in the enormous wool coat despite it being October rather than January, because Dr. Osei had apparently decided it was his coat. Dennis, the project coordinator, was there. Ruiz was there, in a button-down that looked like it had been ironed that morning with great intention. The families from the Glenfield building were represented by a small contingent who had asked, through the building's resident association, whether they could attend, and Vivian had said of course, and they had come in their good clothes and stood near the back and clapped harder than anyone when it was over. Marcus Carter had not been invited, which required no explanation and produced no complaint. Lily was the flower girl, a role she'd accepted on the condition that she could make creative decisions about the execution, which had resulted in a flower distribution strategy that she described as intentional rather than scattered, meaning she'd placed petals in deliberate arrangements rather than simply dropping them, which had taken longer than expected and had caused a brief pause in the processional, during which several people in the front rows had worked very hard not to smile. She'd worn a dress she'd chosen herself, burgundy, with pockets, which she'd checked for structural integrity before leaving the apartment and had pronounced satisfactory. When Vivian walked down the improvised aisle between the chairs and the resident-placed plants and the Okafor family's ferns, Landon looked at her the way he'd been trained by 2 years to look at things that mattered. Not performing an emotion, just receiving one. She was wearing something simple and dark, and she was holding the small bouquet Rachel had helped her choose. And she was walking toward him with the direct, unhurried certainty of a person who'd made a decision she was confident in, which was how she did everything. And he loved that about her, that she never pretended a thing was uncertain when she'd decided it wasn't. She reached him. She looked at him. "Hi," she said, quietly. Just to him. "Hi," he said. They said the things people say at weddings. They said them in their own words, which they'd each written separately and not shown each other in advance, which had been Vivian's idea and which turned out to be the right call, because what they said was specific rather than ceremonial. Specific to the actual history of the actual people standing in the garden, the dinner and the foundation platform and the school pickup and the coffee truck and Bellamy's and the Therizinosaurus and 3 credits and 63 comic pages and the note on the sticky note that was still in the kitchen drawer because he'd never found a better category for it. Lily stood beside her father's mother and held the older woman's hand and watched with the serious attention she gave to everything that was being built. And when it was done and the people around her started clapping, she joined them with a particular satisfaction, the way a person joins in when something has resolved the way they always thought it should. Afterward, when the food was gone and the string lights had come on against the early dark, and the residents had mostly drifted back to their apartments, and the remaining guests were in the loose, easy conversations of people who'd been through something together, Lily found Vivian sitting on one of the garden benches near the edge of the light. She sat beside her without asking. They sat together for a moment, looking at the building where the windows were lit from inside, the ordinary evidence of people at home. "Are you happy?" Lily asked. She asked it the way she asked about the dinosaur displays, directly because she wanted accurate information, not because she was being precocious. Vivian looked at her. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" Lily considered the question with the thoroughness it deserved. "Yes," she said. "I think our family is good now." Vivian looked at the lit windows of the building. She thought about everything she'd built in 10 years. The company, the projects, the reputation, the careful fortress of professional certainty. And she thought about all the things she hadn't known she was missing inside it. She thought about a man in worn boots who'd walked out of a restaurant with his dignity entirely intact and a $40 contribution to a table that hadn't deserved his company. She thought about standing outside an elementary school with a cup of coffee and a feeling she couldn't quite name and hadn't been able to talk herself out of. She thought about Slowly and what Slowly had built. "I think so too," she said. Lily leaned against her side with the easy trust of a child who'd decided the decision was made and didn't need revisiting. Vivian put her arm around the 8-year-old and they sat in the garden that Landon had designed in the building that the three of them had built in different ways and for different reasons, while across the garden Landon was talking to his father. The two of them standing together the way men from the same family stand, the same angle, the same attention. And his father said something and Landon laughed, the real laugh, and looked over at them, and she looked back, and Lily waved at him with the commanding specificity of someone directing traffic. He waved back and turned back to his father, still smiling. The string lights held against the October dark. In the apartments above, families moved through their evenings, the ordinary movements of people who had somewhere to be and someone to be with, the most fundamental human arrangement, built floor by floor from the ground up. The thing about underestimated people, Vivian thought, was not that they didn't know their own worth. It was that the world had organized itself to ignore that worth. And the world was neither always wrong nor always right, but it was very good at persistence, and persistence wears most people down eventually. What it could not account for was the person who declined to be worn down, not through extraordinary resilience, not through the armor of bitterness, but through the simpler and harder discipline of continuing to do the right thing in the right way regardless of who was watching or crediting or recognizing it, because the work itself was worth doing, and that was sufficient reason. Landon Pierce had been that person for years before she'd found him. She hadn't made him that. She'd just been paying attention when everyone else wasn't, which had turned out to be the thing that changed both their lives. She held on to Lily in the garden light and thought that this was what she'd tell her someday, when Lily was old enough and the question came up in whatever form it came up in, that the most important skill she'd ever developed wasn't financial acumen or negotiation or the ability to read a room in 30 seconds. It was the discipline of taking people seriously before they'd proven themselves worth taking seriously. It was the refusal to let someone else's assessment of a person's value become your own default position. She'd learned it from watching a man she barely knew absorb an entire dinner of calculated cruelty and walk away with his character exactly as it had been when he arrived. She'd been learning the rest of it ever since. Across the garden, Landon excused himself from his father and walked towards them, hands in the pockets of his jacket, crossing the distance between the conversation he'd been in and the people he was moving toward. And Lily saw him coming and said, "Dad," in the tone of a person who has something important to report. And he reached them and sat on the other side of Lily and looked at Vivian over their daughter's head in the way he'd been looking at her for 2 years. And the garden held them in its imperfect October light, and the city ran its continuous, indifferent life around them, and the building stood solid above them on the foundation that had been rebuilt correctly. And that was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough, which is the thing about enough that most people spend their whole lives learning to recognize.